Hello everyone, this is Warhawk Beyond 2040 and welcome to a very special edition of the Jazz Albums Review Series. And today I'm going to be taking a look at the amazing and impressive catalogue from one of the greatest and most iconic guitar players of all time, and one of the pioneers of the legato style of playing, and a musician who I have been wanting to talk about on this series for a really long time now. And I am super pumped to be discussing his solo catalogue of albums. And this guy has been a major force in the guitar world for well over 4 decades now, and he is still going very strong to this day as we speak. And this is somebody who, in my opinion, quite frankly, needs no introduction whatsoever. I am talking about, of course, the one and only legendary guitarist, composer, and bandleader, Scott Henderson. So, as I mentioned already, Scott Henderson, one of the greatest and most iconic guitar players of all time, and one of the pioneers of the legato style of playing. And the first time that I became aware of Scott Henderson was through Tribal Tech back in the mid 1990s. And what drew me to Scott Henderson's guitar playing was just the way he played. He played jazz, but it was like cranked up to 10. There was such a rocky ferocity to his playing. He wasn't just burning and shredding for the sake of it. Everything meant something. He was loud, but not loud to the point where you had to cover your ears. Everything about Scott Henderson meant something. It was all done for a reason. He was playing with a more of a rock approach to jazz music, but also had lots of blues flavors to his playing. And I thought Scott Henderson was just unbelievable. His guitar playing just made my jaw drop and just completely floored me. And he is the entire package. He can do it all from jazz to rock to blues. He can create different styles and sounds and tones. There is nothing in the world that Scott Henderson can't do. He is so diverse and so versatile. For me, Scott Henderson is one of the true guitar legends. And I said it before, I consider Scott Henderson to be in that trinity of legato style of playing with Allan Holdsworth and Frank Gambale. But Scott Henderson is a very different beast to those two guys. Holdsworth brought more of a jazzier tone to his playing. Gambale has more of a rockier approach, and Henderson, on the other hand, while he does embrace the jazz and the rock in his music, he also embraces a lot of blues. But he's not what you would call a copycat of Holdsworth and Gambale. He's very much his own man, and he has managed to blend all of those styles and come up with his own unique voice. There are very few people out there that sound like Scott Henderson. If you were to combine Allan Holdsworth, Jeff Beck, and Jimi Hendrix, wrap them all up into one, you would get Scott Henderson. And as I said, Scott Henderson has a very unique and distinct sound. When you hear him, you know straight away it's him. He's got an instant recognizable sound. As I said, there are very few people out there that sound quite like Scott Henderson. And the interesting thing about Scott Henderson for me, growing up, I had no idea he was part of the Chick Corea Electric Band. I found out from my dad that before Frank Gambale, Scott Henderson was the original guitarist, and I couldn't believe it. I thought, wow, Scott Henderson was actually part of the Electric Band and played with Dave Weckl and John Patitucci. I couldn't believe it. And when I went back and dug up as many old films as I could find, Scott Henderson, even in 1986, was already a monster. He was slaying everyone with his guitar playing, even back then. And wow, his playing back in '86 just continued to blow me away. And I still say to this day, out of everything that Scott Henderson has done, I still consider the Electric Band to be his best guitar playing ever. He was just unbelievable. Although short lived, of course, but just that brief time he was with the Electric Band, his guitar playing just completely knocked my socks off. And since bursting onto the scene in the early 1980s, Scott Henderson has seen it all, done it all, and played and collaborated with just about everyone, from Steve Bailey to Greg Bissonette to Jeff Berlin to Tom Coster to Sandeep Chowta to Billy Childs to Carl Verheyen to the Chick Who Electric Band to Dennis Chambers to Gerald Grandwall to Virgil Donati to Jean-Luc Ponty to Bernie Williams to Joe Zawinul's Syndicate, to Vital Tectones with Victor Woodson and Steve Smith, to HBC with Jeff Berlin and Dennis Chambers, to Players with Steve Smith, Jeff Berlin and T. Levitz. You name it, Scott Henderson has played and collaborated with everyone and is best known for his long association as the founder of legendary jazz fusion band Tribal Tech and is part of the classic quartet lineup with Gary Willis, Scott Kinsey, and Kirk Covington. So, for today's special edition, I am going to be taking a look at Scott Henderson's solo catalogue of albums, which is a total of 7 albums, 6 studio recordings, and 1 double live album. And I can honestly tell you now, there is no bad album in Scott Henderson's catalogue. Obviously, there are some albums that are a little bit better than others, but I think that when you go through Scott Henderson's solo catalogue, you get to see and hear how much Scott Henderson's guitar playing has evolved. He never repeats himself, he is always reinventing himself, constantly refining his style, and all of these albums are very different from one another. They don't all sound the same. Scott Henderson is always trying out new things, trying out new ideas, and constantly experimenting with different styles and sounds. But when you listen to all of these albums, the first thing you hear is, yeah, that's Scott Henderson. I know who that is because, as I said at the beginning, he's got such a distinct sound on the guitar. Sometimes it can be mistaken for Jeff Beck, but as I said, he's not a Jeff Beck copycat. He is very much his own man. So, as always, I am going to be talking about each album individually, and I'll be choosing which one I think is the best one. Not an easy challenge. All of these albums are excellent. Any one of these albums could easily be a number one because there's no weak album here. I think all of these albums are fantastic. So we're going to start with the first album, which came out in 1994, and this one is called Dog Party. So Dog Party is very heavy blues influenced, but there's also a lot of jazz and rock flavors to this album as well. As I said, Scott Henderson, unlike Gambale and Holdsworth, he brings much more of a bluesy quality to his playing and his music. And it's a very enjoyable album, but I feel that with this album, as good as it is, it's a great album. I think some of his later albums are probably a little bit better than others. As I said, I do like blues to a point, but I feel that when Scott Henderson gets his jazz fusion hat on, there are very few guys out there who can go toe to toe with him and match up with Scott Henderson. He is an absolute badass in that genre. But it's still very good, this album. Dog Party is quite a fun album. So let's have a look, shall we? Oh boy. So, as I said, this album is very much a bluesy type of album. There's lots of vocals, but there's still plenty of burning guitar playing that only Scott Henderson can deliver. So, of course, we've got Scott Henderson on guitar, Kirk Covington from Tribal Tech on drums and vocals, Richard Roos on bass, Pat O'Brien on harmonica, Scott Kinsey on keyboards from Tribal Tech, Stan Martin on trumpet, Mike Whitman on sax, Erin McGuire on vocals, Linda Zig Zeragali on harmonica, and we've also got guitar solos from Willie Scrub Scoggins, Steve Huey Fibudi Travato, Keith Mr. Big D Wyatt, Scott Slim Hutchinson Henderson, and TJ Moose Helmrich. So obviously there's a little joke there with Scott Henderson, but still a very fun album nonetheless. So most of the compositions are written and composed by Scott Henderson, with the exception of Hound Dog. And we've got 7 vocal tracks on this album. As I said, I do like blues to a point, but I feel that maybe if we tone down on the vocals just a bit more, maybe kept this to more instrumental, we'd probably be having a very different conversation. As I said, Scott Henderson does the blues as good as anybody I have ever heard, but at the same time, I much prefer to hear him more in a jazz fusion setting, because I feel that's where he really excels and that's where he's at his absolute best. But at the same time, I respect Scott Henderson for wanting to go in a completely different direction and wanting to try his luck at something totally new to him. So props to him. So we've got Hole Digging, which is a great opener. Fence Climbing Blues, which is just absolutely funny, with Kurt Covington singing away. Dog Party's a great track as well. Same as You, which is again Erin McGuire on vocals. That's just absolutely hilarious. And then we've got Milkbone, which is another fun track as well. Hellbent's Pup is a great track. Hound Dog is great. Dog Walk is great. Smelly Old Dog Blues, which is great. And Too Many Guitars, which is another great track as well. But I'd say overall, in my honest opinion, it's a good solid album. Maybe a bit too heavy on the blues side of things, but still good stuff nonetheless. So standout tracks for me are Hole Digging, Same as You, Milkbone, Dog Walk, Smelly Old Dog Blues, and Too Many Guitars. But good fun album. As I said, this is the first solo debut album from Scott Henderson. If you're expecting to hear Tribal Tech style on this music, you're not going to find it. Obviously, you can hear some influences of Tribal Tech, but this is very much a Scott Henderson solo album and leans very heavy towards the blues, but very enjoyable nonetheless. And I'll say, if you're a big fan of blues, I think you'll like this one a lot. It's a lot of fun. So there you have it. Scott Henderson, Dog Party. Great stuff. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 1997, and this one is called Tor Downhouse. So this is kind of a continuation of Dog Party, very heavy blues influenced style of music, but still some great tracks on here. There are about 3 instrumentals, including a cover version of one of the legendary tracks from the late great bassist Jaco Pastorius. But most of this album features heavy blues vocals. And as I said before, I do like the blues, but I feel that too much vocals is a bit of a bad thing. I prefer to hear my instrumental stuff and my guy playing the guitar. But there's still some good stuff here nonetheless. So let's have a look, shall we? And there we are. There are the guys. And there's the neighbourhood as well. So we've got Scott Henderson on guitar, Thelma Houston on vocals, who sings on most of this album, Master Edwards on vocals, Dave Carpenter on bass, Kurt Covington from Tribal Tech on drums, Pat O'Brien on harmonica, Scott Kinsey from Tribal Tech on keyboards, Albert Wing on alto, tenor, sax, flute, and fearless horn, Walt Fowler on trumpet and flugelhorn, Mike Nelson on tenor and baritone sax, Dan Forino on trumpet and flugelhorn, Eric Jorgensen on trombone, and TJ Helmerich and Mark Monitza on background vocals. As I said, it's a good album, bit too heavy on the vocals for my liking, but there's still some great stuff here. And all of the compositions are written and composed by Scott Henderson, with the exception of one track, which is a cover, which was originally composed, as I mentioned, by Jaco Pastorius. But still, good album nonetheless, but maybe a bit too heavy on the vocals for my taste. So we've got Dolmite, which is a good opener, Tor Downhouse, which is the title track, Meter Maid, I Hate You, Guitar School, Xanax, great cover version of Continuum, You Get Off on Me, Mokha, Harpoon, and Same as You. Good collection of songs, but as I said, a little bit too heavy on the vocals for my liking. But the good stuff that are on this album, they really stand out to me. So the standout tracks for me are, of course, Continuum, which is a brilliant version by Scott Henderson, Dolmite, Tor Downhouse, I Hate You, Harpoon, You Get Off on Me, and Guitar School. Those are the tracks that really stood out to me. But as I said, good stuff. I enjoy it. Bit too heavy on the vocals, but I think the rest of it does hold up pretty well. But I think there are better Scott Henderson albums in this catalogue. There's no bad ones here, but as I said, the later ones I think are just a little bit stronger for me. So there you have it. Tor Downhouse, great follow-up to Dog Party, but again, a little bit too heavy on the bluesy vocals for my like, but that's just me. So there you have it. Tor Downhouse, great follow-up. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 2002, and this one is called Well to the Bone. So again, Well to the Bone is kind of a continuation of the last two albums, where Scott Henderson has been exploring more of the bluesy style of music, but this time we are scaling down on the guest vocalists. Still got vocal tracks on it, but it's starting to become more of a power trio kind of affair now. So the core of the band we've got is Scott Henderson on guitar, Kurt Covington on drums and vocals, and John Humphrey on bass. And on vocals we've got Thelma Houston, Wade Dewham, and we've got Scott Kinsey on electronic percussion. So as I said, it's still very much in the bluesy style of music, but now we're starting to slowly move away from that as Scott Henderson is getting into what we know him for. So let's have a look, shall we? So it looks like from far away, it looks like sausages and stuff, but it's all batteries and wiring. There we are. There is the man himself. So all of the music is written and composed by Scott Henderson. So we've got Lady P, which is a great opener. Hillbilly in the Band, another great track. Devil Boy. Lola Faye. We've got the title track, Well to the Bone, which is great. Ashes is another great track. Sultan's Boogie. That's the Way It Go, which is another great track. That Hurts, and Rituals. So there are I would say about 3 or 4 vocal tracks, but the rest is instrumental. And Kurt Covington does sing, but we're starting to slowly move away from the vocals. There's not as much vocals as there was on the first 2 albums, but still good stuff here nonetheless. So standout tracks for me are Lady P, Hillbilly in the Band, Devil Boy, Well to the Bone, Sultan's Boogie, That Hurts, and Ritual. But good, enjoyable album. As I said, I do like the blues, but just maybe a little bit too heavy on the vocals for my liking. But the vocals are starting to tone down. Scott Henderson really burns it up on guitar. John Humphrey, rock solid bass player, and Kurt Covington brings so much power to the music with his drumming. Tremendous stuff here. So there you have it. Well to the bone. Very enjoyable album, but at the same time, the vocals kind of let it down for me. But the good stuff on here, that really outweighs the bad stuff for me anyway. So there you have it. Well to the bone. Good stuff here. So we move on to the next album, which came out in 2005. And this is a double live album. And this one is simply called Live. So Live, for me, this is the one that I have been waiting for, and it more than delivers. This is Scott Henderson at his absolute monstrous best in a power trio setting, and for me, this is so much better than the three albums that came before. Yes, still very much heavy on the blues side, but this is a lot more jazz fusion oriented and packs a hell of a punch. And this is what we want to hear from Scott Henderson. Scott Henderson burning it up and shredding it like no other guitar player can. And this is for me Scott Henderson at his absolute best, live in a power trio, doing what he does best, and that's play his goddamn ass off. And absolutely love this album. Absolutely amazing. So we've got Kurt Covington on drums and John Humphrey on bass, and of course Scott Henderson on guitar. Excellent stuff, and so much better than the three albums that came before. Absolutely enjoyable. So let's have a look, shall we? There we are. Excellent stuff. Yes, Kurt Covington does sing, but not as much. But wow, this is tremendous stuff. And it's a double album. What more can you ask for? Scott Henderson live, double live recording. Doesn't get any better than that. So on disc one, we've got Sliding, Well to the Bone, Sultan's Boogie, Xanax, Lady P, Jakarta, Tacos Are Good. And then on disc two, we got Dog Party, Fee Fi Fo Fum, Meter Maid, Nairobi Express, Devil Boy, and Hillbilly in the Band. So there's some Tribal Tech originals which are reworked as a power trio, and of course some Scott Henderson solo material. It's all here. It's absolutely amazing, absolutely brilliant. We've even got a Vital Tech Tones track, which was written and composed by Victor Wooten, Steve Smith, and Scott Henderson. And Fee Fi Fo Fum was, of course, written and composed by the legendary Wayne Shorter from Weather Report. So there's plenty of good stuff here. I love it. This is what we wanted from Scott Henderson, and he more than delivers on the goods. And for me, Scott Henderson is at his absolute best live in a power trio environment. So standout tracks for me on disc one are Sliding, Sultan's Boogie, Jakarta, and Tacos Are Good. And the standout tracks for me on disc two are Fee Fi Fo Fum, Meter Maid, Nairobi Express, and Hillbilly in the Band. Doesn't get any better than this. Scott Henderson in the live environment, playing his ass off in a power trio. Absolutely love this album a lot. And as someone who has seen Scott Henderson live, as great as he is in the studio, I think Scott Henderson sounds even better live. He is untouchable, and as I said, very few can match him. So there you have it, Scott Henderson live, absolutely fantastic. One of my all-time favourites Scott Henderson albums from his solo catalogue. Excellent stuff. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 2015, and this one is called Vibe Station. So Vibe Station sees Scott Henderson has completely packed up all vocal tracks. We're now back to playing jazz fusion instrumental style of music, and we see Scott Henderson in a power trio environment once again. And this features Allan Hertz on drums and Travis Colton on bass, the son of legendary guitarist Larry Colton, and of course Scott Henderson on guitar. For me, much, much better than the first three albums. Still obviously bluesy, but this is now all instrumental, fusion heavy, very tasty, plenty of burning guitar playing, lots of power. This is what we want from Scott Henderson, and he's back to his ferocious best. Nothing against the blues stuff, but I feel it was a little bit too much to the point of overkill. This is what we want from Scott Henderson. Scott Henderson doing what he does best, and that's play his damn ass off. So let's have a look, shall we? There we are. There's not really much to see here, really. So most of the compositions are written and composed by Scott Henderson, with the exception of one track. But this is absolutely amazing. Scott Henderson, back to his jazz fusion roots, in a power trio, doing what he does best, and I absolutely love this album. This album is absolutely excellent, and as I said at the beginning, nothing against his blues stuff, but this is what we want from Scott Henderson. All instrumental and kicking ass. Allan Hertz, excellent drummer. Travis Colton, rock solid as a bass player, and Scott Henderson on top musical form. So tracks we got here are Church of Exotic Dance, Sphinx, the title track Vibe Station, Manic Carpet, Cowhound, The Covered Head, Festival of Ghosts, Do What, and Chelsea Bridge. Excellent collection of songs from start to finish. Every single track just absolutely rocks. Standout tracks for me are Church of Exotic Dance, Vibe Station, Manic Carpet, The Covered Head, Festival of Ghosts, and Chelsea Bridge. Excellent album, very strong, great sounding production, everybody on top form. Unbelievable album, love it. So there you have it. Vibe Station, excellent album. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 2019, and this one is called People Mover. So this sees Scott Henderson officially form his brand new working trio featuring two great young musicians, and this band have remained together and still are playing together to this day, and they make their recorded debut as a unit, and this album absolutely rocks. And what more can you say, really? Scott Henderson in a trio, enough said. Absolutely brilliant. So the two young musicians we got on here are Romain Labbé on bass, Archibald Ligonier on drums, and of course Scott Henderson on guitar. And all of the compositions are written and composed by Scott Henderson. Absolutely brilliant stuff here. This is exactly what we want to hear from Scott Henderson, and he has never sounded better than he does in a trio setting. So the first track we got is Transatlantic, excellent opener. Primary Location, another great track. All Aboard, another great track. The title track, People Mover, excellent. Satellite is brilliant. Blood Moon is great. Blue Heron Boulevard, great track. Syringe is another great track. Happy Fun Sing is great. And Form. Every track from start to finish is brilliant, and I love it. Great, great stuff here. Scott Henderson burning it up as always, and the other two guys with him, they just absolutely rock as a rhythm section. So the standout tracks for me are Transatlantic, Primary Location, People Mover, Blood Moon, Blue Heron, Boulevard, Syringe, and Form. When you get Scott Henderson in a trio, 95% of the time, you're never going to go wrong, because for me, this is an environment that Scott Henderson thrives in. He's great with tribal tech. Of course, he's great with the electric band and all the other projects. But for me, Scott Henderson is unbeatable in the trio setting. Doesn't get any better than that. So there you have it. People Mover. Excellent album, and what an amazing trio who I had the great privilege of seeing once back in 2017. And whew, they really pack a mean punch. So there you have it. People Mover. Great stuff. So we move on to the next album, and this one came out in 2024. And this is Scott Henderson's newest and latest recording, Carnival. Excellent album, as you'd expect. Scott Henderson returning with his working trio. Doesn't get any better than this. And this is kind of like Scott Henderson's play on theme parks and carnivals, hence the names of the carnival inspired tracks on this album. But still very fun, still very enjoyable. Scott Henderson doing what he does best, and that's burning it up on the guitar. And we see the return of Scott Henderson with his working trio comprised of Romain Labbé on bass and Archibald Ligonier on drums, and of course Scott Henderson on guitar. All compositions written and composed by Scott Henderson, and some contributions of electronic percussion provided by Scott Kinsey from Tribal Tech. Excellent stuff here. Doesn't get any better than this. Romain Labbé smoking it up on the bass, and Archibald Ligonier on drums. He's just delivering tasty drumming, and Henderson, what more can you say? Scott Henderson is one of the baddest guitar players on the planet, and wow, this album absolutely rocks. So tracks we got here are Step Right Up, the title track Carnival, Haunted Ballroom, COVID Vaccination, Purito Madero, Sea Around Us, Sky Coaster, Green Mansion, Village Rats, and Acacia and Carney's Time. Great album, very fun, very enjoyable. A little bit, a couple of differences with this one. We've actually got a solo guitar track from Scott Henderson, which is absolutely incredible. And good to see Scott Henderson trying out new things, as he always does, but still sounding very much like the man we know and love. So, standout tracks for me are Step Right Up, Carnival, Haunted Ballroom, Purito Madero, Sea Around Us, Green Mansion, Acacia, and Carney's Time. Great album, one of Scott Henderson's absolute best, and as I said previously, a strong contender for one of the best albums of 2024. Loved it. Great stuff here. So there you have it. Scott Henderson, Carnival. Tremendous stuff here, in my opinion. So, which Scott Henderson album do I think is the best one? Well, as I said, this is a very strong and incredible catalogue, but I feel with some of the earlier Scott Henderson albums, although they had great tracks, I think what kind of let them down for me was far too much bluesy vocals for my liking, and I feel that's what kind of spoiled them a little bit. Still good albums, still very enjoyable, but I think the second half of his catalogue, the later albums, I think are some of his best albums ever. If I were to cut this catalogue in half, take out the first three, and just keep the three studio albums and the live album, I think we would be having a very different conversation, and I think this catalogue would be so much more stronger and a lot more higher. As I said, there's no bad album in this catalogue. They're all good, all different, but I feel that the later albums, I think, are much better. Pretty much when he packed up the vocals, in my opinion. Once he packed up the vocals, it was just full speed ahead and some of his best music he has ever written. So for me, the best Scott Henderson album, I do love the live album, but I'm going with the more recent one, Carnival. I just think this one is absolutely brilliant. People Mover is great, but I think this one is just a little bit more higher. It's wild, it's ferocious, it packs a punch, it's everything you want from a Scott Henderson album and then some, and he just absolutely delivers the goods. And as I said, As much as I love Scott Henderson in Tribal Tech and in the Electric Band and all the other various projects, for me, Scott Henderson in a trio environment is unbeatable, and this is a fine example of that statement. So there you have it. Carnival, for me, the best Scott Henderson solo album of his entire catalogue. And the double live album, I definitely put up there with Carnival, but the only reason I didn't choose it as the best one is simply because there were quite a few vocal tracks on that one which kind of lost it on me a little bit, but still very enjoyable and certainly a lot more stronger than the first three Scott Henderson solo albums. But for me, Carnival is absolutely tremendous, probably my favourite Scott Henderson album of his entire solo catalogue, and probably his best album to date so far. I think it's one of his strongest, and this trio he's got just absolutely smokes, and they just continue to get better and better with every listen. So there you have it. Carnival, for me, the best Scott Henderson album of his solo catalogue. Absolutely tremendous. Love this one so much. Really good. So that's going to be it from me. I am going to wrap this up now. What's your favourite Scott Henderson album? Is it Dog Party, Tor Downhouse, Well to the Bone, Live, Vibe Station, People Mover, or Carnival? There's no right or wrong answer. We all have our favourite albums. You know what to do, guys. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, leave your thoughts and comments down below. And I will see all of you next time for another edition of the Jazz Albums Review Series. So until then, take care, everybody, and stay safe. And once again, as always, much appreciated. Thanks for listening.